Hi, welcome to NARA Fellowship. Today we have Gregory Diehl with us, an author, learner, and also a traveler with stories to tell, with interesting things that he's done and is doing. So thank you very much for joining us, Gregory.
Thanks for
Um,
having me.
he's the way I found Gregory was, correct me if I'm wrong, but are you part of the Now page thing?
Now page? What is
Yeah.
that?
Now page is a thing that Derek Silver started that is like a website status update of what you're doing and what your goals are. And people can put it as they wish. And there's like a website called nownow.com, and it has a directory of people from all over the world. And I found a bunch of interesting guests um, and different authors and podcasts and stuff to it. And I was wondering if you were one of the ones that I found that way.
That doesn't ring a bell unless someone added me to that without my knowledge, but maybe I
No,
should look into that.
no, you have to apply for it.
The Now page.
Yeah,
Okay,
I'll
I'll look
send you a
into that.
link about it. It's fun.
Sure.
It's more individuals, not for businesses, to keep things kind of social. And
Hmm.
it's for people who are not on social media or just don't um, they need something more uh, not as fluctuating as a Twitter feed or X feed as I should say. Um, but anyhow, um, moving right along, I found him through a rabbit trail of my own, and I bought his book, The Influential Author, which is a very interesting book. I'm still reading it, but I thought he would be a great guest for the show. And I'm doing a lousy introduction, I apologize. But
You're fine.
Gregory, if you could explain uh, your background and who you are and a little bit about yourself, that would be great.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I have traveled around the world quite a bit, basically all through my 20s. I did that for more than 10 years. I've been to 56 countries at this point. And the reason I did that was because I was very hungry for knowledge and experience, particularly of the type that I didn't feel like I could get through any other source. I grew up in San Diego, California, and I was the kind of student who was always disappointed in the educational opportunities available to me. I was the guy in high school who never studied or did any work in class, but still aced all the tests because it was just
Wow.
easy for me to derive the right answers or very quickly learn what I needed to and then forget it as soon as I no longer needed it, right? And I didn't go to a particularly poor quality high school or anything. It was just that's how it was, and that's what kind of person I was, right? So I was an information sponge, and I was very passionate about learning, but always on my own terms. And I really resented being forced to learn in a particular way on a particular subject. And so when the time came that I was finishing high school, and everyone said, "Well, you got to go to college, and you got to do all these things and follow the plan," no one could really give me a compelling reason to. And so I just said, I think I'm going to go do my own thing instead. And it was a very chaotic path in a lot of ways, but it was kind of what I needed to do to assert my own freedom and learn how the world worked on my own terms and discover what kind of person I was. So certainly not the path for everyone. That did become the subject of the second book I ever wrote, which was called Travel as Transformation. Essentially, how world travel can really change your sense of identity and your understanding of how the world works. And I think that in a way that few other things can. And authorship became a very important catalyst for me and a professional focus because I realized that my biggest, most important educational influences, besides just the stuff I personally experienced through my lifestyle, was by reading really interesting thinkers who explained really complex, important things in just the most ordered and logical ways, where suddenly this thing made sense to me that in a way that no one else could possibly explain. Guys like Isaac Asimov were some of my favorite authors when I was young because not just his science fiction stuff, but his breakdown of the history of the sciences and the process of discovery and how human beings figured out how the universe works. I found that kind of stuff really inspiring, and particularly just how well he explained everything. And I think that is what made me realize that I too have a particularly good ability for explaining difficult things in very logical, very ordered ways that most other people can understand. So, in addition to writing various nonfiction books, I've been an educator in a variety of fields up until this point in my life. And now I currently run what we are calling a retreat center in a village called Calavan in a remote part of Armenia, where we offer educational and lifestyle opportunities that don't really exist in this country.
Wow, that's a lot. That's
It's a lot,
fantastic.
yes. Thank you.
That's so cool. You kind of partially answered my first question, but you might have other thoughts that you might like to elaborate on.
Okay.
Um, so, what was your learning journey? You kind of explained from school to going abroad and learning by doing and living life, which is one of the best ways to learn. Um,
Hmm.
what what were some of the things that? Well, I can some fine tune it a little bit. What were some of the things that you learned traveling as opposed to reading the great thinkers that the books you devoured?
Sure. Well, there are certain types of things that I think you can only learn through personal experience, and certain kinds of things that you can't learn through personal experience because they're the work of many generations of subsequent discovery, right?
Mm,
That's the kind of stuff I was talking about with Isaac Asimov. That um, how did people over hundreds of years slowly figure out how the universe works? That's not the thing I could ever really do on my own because I have to stand on the shoulders of giants who came before me, right?
yeah.
And you really gain an appreciation for that once you understand how the process of discovery and explanation and education works. That it is this massive, ongoing intergenerational effort to figure out what the heck is going on and what we as a species are doing and how we've evolved and grown philosophically, technologically, politically, economically. That kind of almost has like a religious feel to it where you start to feel like you're part of something much larger than yourself, this ongoing human effort to make sense out of the universe and build order in a chaotic universe.
Mm,
And the personal experience stuff, like, someone could have tried to explain to me how the world works, what the present state of human civilization is like, which I've also, of course, attempted to do for other people in my writings and in the discussions I have with them. I explain to them what I know, what I've experienced, what I've observed, but that would never be the same thing as having personally lived through it and had very interesting, surprising, at times chaotic and traumatic experiences and extreme situations around the world. And that, I think, is how you really figure out who you are as a person and
mm,
what your values are and how you respond to different types of stimuli, how you develop character. Essentially,
mm,
you have to do that as a personal experience. No amount of simply explaining it as words and concepts will ever have the same emotional effect on you to develop the memories of these things that you have been through and how they've affected you. That doesn't mean everybody needs to travel around the world, but they certainly need to put themselves in interesting, extreme situations that challenge them in a uniquely personal kind of way. Travel was just a really good catalyst for me, particularly for that.
cool. So it's like exploring the unknown. It's like there's a image of someone in the known world stepping into the unknown world, and we
The
always
hero's
need to
journey,
explode. Yeah, the hero's
essentially,
journey.
this
There's an
special
artwork,
world.
a medieval artwork that I'm remembering. One is all sunlight and daylight, and it's known, and then the nighttime is outside of the dome of daylight, and it's like exploring the unknown,
Right?
and we don't really
Enlightenment.
know who we are until, like as you were saying, until we experience the unknown. It doesn't mean
Hmm.
we go be reckless and do stupid, you know.
Well, it's a
Um,
little bit of that because you
a
don't know
little
what you're
bit, yeah.
doing,
It's
particularly when you start. So
it
it has to be a bit reckless.
it's kind of like controlled chaos. You
Yeah.
don't want to be, you know, good, going into a war zone if you don't have to, unless you're a photojournalist or something, you know.
Hmm.
But um, all at the same time, you you want to broaden your horizons, and it's like, so I totally understand what you're saying. That's cool. Um, so what? So you actually, because you were traveling in foreign countries, you dealt with situations that were not normal for you, and it broadened your horizons and also challenged your preconceived notions of what what you assume was normal and not normal. And so, what were some life lessons that you learned from traveling? Don't assume.
Well, you have to assume that's unfortunate. That's we're all biased in that way because we all have a worldview, a paradigm of how things work. And obviously, that's very useful in some situations because you can't go into every situation blind, knowing nothing. You have to be able to act in some form. But when you expose yourself to situations where your working paradigm fails, and you realize you don't know what you're doing here and things work completely differently than you assumed they did, that's when you have to adjust that paradigm. And as long as you are cognitively flexible enough to do that, you can overcome virtually any challenge that you face. Travel is really good for that because you're exposed to all kinds of different cultural circumstances that really force you to reconsider what does it mean to be a human? How do human beings live on this planet? How do they behave and why? And sometimes that's like the really obvious challenging things like going to societies where the rules they impose on people just seem like something from an alien planet, like violations of human rights, forcing women to wear hijabs and burqas, not respecting each other in really obvious ways that you think, well, this is just how the civilized world works, obviously. And sometimes the world doesn't work the way that you assume must be obvious. I'll give you an example. I've lived in Armenia now, Eastern Europe, for the last 5 years in a village where I started this retreat center. And when I came here, it's because many of the people were promoting that they wanted to teach entrepreneurship and business principles to the locals here. And when I got here expecting to play a role in that, instead, what I found is that these people have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. They're using words that they do not understand the meaning of simply because they have heard them and they're popular and have a positive conception. And so then I started to write a book. This was my fifth book called Everyone is an Entrepreneur Selling Economic Self Determination in a Post Soviet World. And the book became about why people living in this part of the world do not understand the most basic concepts of economics, entrepreneurship, and business that seem obvious to virtually every American and Westerner, even ones who have no formal business training whatsoever. So it's one of those huge culture shock things that even to someone who's been to more than 50 countries, you think you're prepared for anything, but then you get here, you try to integrate with these people, and you realize their worldview is so different than your own. It's I have honestly compared it to like going to a society that has not yet invented the wheel.
Mm,
And you try to explain to them, like, here's this really simple mechanism that anyone can understand, and you can clearly see how it works and why it works, and be really advantageous for you to use this thing called the wheel. I'm not saying I invented the wheel. I'm saying, the rest of the world largely knows how this works, and they use it every day of their lives to improve their lives. And you try to show them, and you're met with confusion, at times violent resistance, and 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 honestly, it really shows you the limitations of certain cultural paradigms that people do not want to expand the way they think and live. They want to stick with the way their ancestors done things and the way their parents enforce that they do things, and their school and their government and their religion enforces that they do things. And they generally do not want to change and learn and grow. And as an
yeah,
educator, that's like just mind blowing for me that, and not at all trying to enforce a certain worldview on people. It's really it's just fascinating to see that they will not willingly expand their own paradigm when it should be obvious how it would benefit them to do so.
yeah. That's interesting. It's like they're steeped in traditionalism, and it doesn't. They don't have. We have the. I'm sure they have. You know, I'm sure all cultures have some mix of people who are traditionalists or conservatives, and others who are progressives and liberals, and they're always bickering with one another. But it's interesting that you come upon this in the culture that in Armenia, where they don't even conceive of the idea that you can change yourself and change
Mm-hmm.
your circumstances. That's that's really eye opening because I know one other example. There's a gentleman in my little corner of the internet who's a pastor, and years ago he did ministry work down in the Dominican Republic, and He was part of the missionary team, and they go in with all these ideas of how they're going to help and support all these people, and they're blown out of the water. These people who are poor and
Yeah.
more less educated than them, they have stronger faith than they do. And one of the things is trying to teach them about hygiene and trying to explain the concept that there's a little germ that's invisible to us that makes us get sick, and they just laugh at you because it's like
Yeah.
because from their culture it's like that means nothing. It's like a little invisible something is gonna get me sick.
And if you
Right,
understand the history of medicine and the development of the biological sciences, like what I was
right,
talking about, it's fascinating to read that the first guys to figure that kind of stuff out, like the germ theory of disease, faced exactly the same reaction. When they tried to
yeah,
tell doctors, like, hey, start washing your hands between surgeries and less of your patients will get sick and die,
yeah,
they laugh at them and they say,
yeah,
get this fucking lunatic out of here. This guy's crazy. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
yeah,
Things that seem obvious to us because we've grown up learning them and we see how logically they make sense and we see the effects of them. They will not open their mind to consider a new causal paradigm of how things work and how it would benefit them. Even when lives are at stake, they will not consider maybe he's onto something. Maybe we should look
yeah.
into
It took
this.
like 50 years or some ridiculous thing before they stopped and
It
started
takes
washing their
generations.
hands.
Because
But
people past a certain age cannot learn new information by and large unless they're an exceptional thinker, as I assume you are, as I assume most of the people listening to you right now must
yeah,
be. If you're particularly interested in education, it's because you have this superhuman ability to change the way you think and constantly be learning and growing throughout your life. But 99% of people do not do that.
yeah, it's more I call them the salt of the earth, the regular
Yeah.
people. You know, God must love them because He's made so many of them. But
And that's how I realized,
yeah,
because as I was saying, like I developed this passion and this particularly an ability for explaining complex things in comprehensible ways that almost anyone can understand.
yeah,
And then it was very humbling to realize that that's not the major problem. I mean, that is
mm,
important. That's why I continue to write books, and I encourage other people to do this if they're a good explainer, a good educator. Explain what you know as well as you can because that's really valuable. But then
it
I,
helps you
but
learn it
to
too.
yeah, but to realize that that's not what's preventing most people from learning. It's not just that the information isn't available, it's that they don't want the information, that there's a
Mm,
door in their mind that is closed almost all the time. So that no matter
mm,
how good the information is, they won't take it. They don't
yeah,
want it.
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. It's like people's worldviews and perceptions, and like one thing for me that's probably a door that I keep closed, but I don't mean to. It just I've always had this conception in my mind that I'm not good at math. It's
Hmm.
really a struggle with me, and
Okay.
so that would be an example of somebody keeping their mind closed and stuff. And I'm like, ask me about you know uh, fractions, and I'm like, I couldn't get it back in elementary school. And I'm like, I still kind of get, I know one half because I accidentally got half the candy bar because I thought it was the smallest amount. And I'm like, oh, that's a half. I learned that concept really quick from the candy bar. They was breaking the candy bar, Hershey bar into the different fractions of whatever you asked for. And I thought 1/2 would be the smallest. I was like, I learned quickly then. But you know, that's one of the things I really enjoyed your book is that you're a very good synthesizer. In
Hmm.
taking complex stuff and making it not not simple like baby food kind of stuff, but more like a nice well cooked meal. And it's like, oh, okay, I get this now. and and it was a little easier to consume. So I
Mm.
really appreciate that.
I think of it
Um,
as integration,
yeah,
taking things that seem like separate subjects and then showing the logical connection between all these seemingly different things, kind of the trunk of the tree from which they all branch outward. And if you
yeah.
can do that, if you can logically show, okay, you have to understand this, this, and this, and then finally this conclusion, the ultimate thing that I'm trying to explain to you will make a lot more sense if you understand the things that logically have to precede it instead of just giving you the conclusion.
I have a question for you. It's like,
Yeah.
do you ever wrestle with, since you like to learn on your own terms back when you were in school,
Hmm.
and people tried to force you to learn a certain way, when you wrote your books, did you come into this like realization like, oh, I have to present it in a certain way in order to present
No.
the information. But I still want to do it this way. Or do you just like, well, this would make sense for me. I'll lay it out this way for you, and hopefully it works for you, and then you can bounce around as you wish or something.
So there are a few answers to that.
Mm,
One is that, of course, you have to work within the limitations of the medium. So if I were presenting a video essay or a lecture about something, that would be different than writing a book because the medium works differently. The people are consuming it under different circumstances. And a book is fortunately a very well established medium. In fact, it's probably our oldest medium of information, basically, right, even preceding the printing press. But since the printing press was invented, it became, mass adopted this way of producing and consuming books beyond just scholars painstakingly reproducing things by hand. Now it became accessible for more and more people to put their information down as words in a printed and bound book. So the medium has had, at least a few hundred years to kind of establish certain standards of how books work and what people expect from books, right?
mm,
And there's still a lot of flexibility within that because there are many types of books and there are many ways you can approach writing a book. And every author, of course, is going to have their style. So you need to have confidence in your ability to write the way you want and present information the way you want. I think a lot of weaknesses new authors have is they want to copy whatever the most popular authors in their field do. And that's something I warn against in The Influential Author. If you want to write a good nonfiction book about something, do not just do what you see as popular, but instead do what makes sense to you and is true for you. I came from a background of being a very good teacher of things. So that's how I looked at the process of writing a nonfiction book. How would I explain every detail in a logical, hierarchical way about this complex subject? And you don't just blindly leave it at that as well. I think it's pretty good, let's print it, right? You go through this iterative process over the course of hopefully many months at the very least to figure out what holes do I still have in my knowledge, what am I not explaining clearly enough, what am I being redundant about, what can I cut out because I've already explained it well enough, what concepts are in the wrong order. And you do that through beta readers, which I explain the process of in the book, that you want to curate a group of people who represent the right kind of audience to read the early work and say, oh, here's what I love, here's what I hate, here's what doesn't make sense to me, here's what I think you need more of. And eventually you end up with a product that does what you intended it to do, and hopefully people who read it and judge it and leave reviews are evaluating it under those terms. Here's what I intended the book to do. Do you think it does that? Rather than some other arbitrary terms they might have made up, which is the equivalent of like, going to see a scary movie and complaining that it wasn't funny enough or something. Because
yeah,
there will always
exactly.
be that kind of person, but
Yeah,
that person is just bad at consuming art, I think.
yeah. It's like, yeah. Um, Talking about teaching and learning, what I'd like to ask you is, what are your personal learning pursuits, professionally and personally?
Yeah, well, I'm the kind of person who I will never have enough hours in the day or years in my life to learn all the things I would like to learn. So I have to prioritize because of that, right? I have to follow my interests, whichever ones are striking me hardest at any particular time. And of course, it's this emergent process because when you learn more about one thing, suddenly it shows you other new things that you want to learn that you didn't realize you wanted to learn until you got to that point. And I find the same thing happens with writing books too. That if I pour a year of my life into really really trying to hone exactly what I'm trying to say and I publish it, and then as soon as that book is published, it's given me 10 other ideas for other things now that I want to pursue as a
Ah,
book to write. And sometimes they're things I already understand very, very well. And sometimes they're things that I need to learn more about before I can write the kind of book that I want to write. So there's this
mm,
this feedback mechanism, this input and output that honestly is one of the biggest motivations to continue to write more books beyond just other people liking the book or making money from the book. That it's like the best way I know to push my own mind to new places that it wasn't yet ready to go. I just started writing my first novel, a science fiction book,
cool.
which is going to explore things like the nature of alien life in the universe, the Fermi paradox, the nature of consciousness and free will, and all kinds of really far-reaching stuff that I don't have any kind of professional background in, but I feel very strongly and I feel like I understand very well. But in order to feel confident enough to write the book I want to write and to assume that maybe people who know more about me than this might one day read the book and scrutinize it, I have to read more about these concepts to be sure that what I'm thinking and saying makes sense. I can't just say, I think this would be pretty cool if this happened in a book. If I want it to be taken seriously, particularly in the domain of science fiction, which is, compared to real science, it's not fantasy. I can't just make up a magic system and do whatever I want. I have to really assess, does this make sense? Is this realistic? Could this exist the way I'm depicting it? And will people who know 10 times as much as me about this subject scrutinize it and say, yeah, actually, that is logically coherent. That does make sense, that the way you're describing could work. So I
Yeah.
have to learn more about these things before I can write that book, right? That's a really good motivation to push myself into territories that otherwise I wouldn't go.
So, um, so your professional and your personal kind of intertwine because your personal interest in those topics, and then also your professionally for your writing. So that's what it sounds like you're saying. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, why would it be any other way? My professional pursuits are a result of the kind of person I am, the kind of passions I have.
Mm.
I'm not
Some
doing it
people
because I think
work,
there's a
and so
paycheck in it
some
or
people
because
work
someone
in like day
tells me
jobs
to.
and stuff, and so there's not a lot of overlap of the
Yeah,
professional
okay.
and but for
But how did they
authors,
choose the day job they have? Is it just because it seemed like the easiest way to make money or because it was somehow related to something they actually care about as individuals?
I think it's a mix because I think a lot of people do jobs that have no meaning to themselves, but like working in a grocery store, um, working in a manufacturing office, uh, office administration stuff. You know, that's it's one of the things I try to be cognizant of as because I I have health issues, and so I'm able to get special medical rides to my appointments and stuff. And I've met several people who are taxi drivers who are really very learned um, uh, people who enjoy talking to people, and they so that's part of the overlap. And the other part is their day job and their private personal stuff that they just enjoy
Hmm.
learning stuff.
Okay.
And so I have a mix of people, like you and me, creators, content creators, authors, writers, musicians, who do what they do because it's their passion. And then I have people who are regular folks who are just, doing a job to pay the bills. It has some overlap into things that they like to do, like the taxi drivers like to talk to people and meet people, and then so forth. So I got a mix of people. So yeah.
So,
um,
yes, we all have obviously taken jobs before just because we needed the money,
hmm
right? And it was the easiest way to solve the financial problem we had.
Yeah.
But I have personally made it a mission, and I often encourage people to do the same thing. As life goes on and you're clearer and clearer about what your talents and your passions are, one of the biggest tasks, one of the biggest priorities you should assign yourself is how to use your talents and your passions more and more to make a profit, to make money doing the things you actually care about, which is one aspect of entrepreneurship. How can I turn the things I value and I care about into things that other people will also value and care about and hopefully pay money for?
Mm. Yeah.
I've written 7 books at this point. Some have sold quite well by self publishing standards, some have barely sold at all so far. And
Ah.
I think they're pretty good books, obviously, because I
Yeah.
bothered to work so hard on them. And the challenge becomes, how do I convince everyone else that they're good books? How do I get
Yeah.
them in front of the right people who would be willing to pay $10 or $20 for them
Right.
repeatedly, thousands of times over, hopefully?
Right. Yeah, it's hard. Marketing is hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um.
But if you really believe in what you're marketing and the product you produce, then it's worth it to learn all those things.
Yeah. I published a book with my writers group, and I volunteered to do the marketing because I had a media background. I'm not a marketing professional or anything like that, or graduate or anything like that. I just kind of understand the basics, and so I'm just doing the best I can with what I can do at the moment, and getting podcast interviews and getting the word out and promoting it. So I can promote it right now. If I go to the banner where my mouse is not working, there we go. Let's see. So writersofmeaning.com is the Writers of Meaning an anthology on community. Um,
Okay.
that's the little book that we did. And then I'll also put Gregory's uh, links in the description for his books, where you can find out more about him and his books and everything in the video description. So you'll be able to click the link very easily. Um, what I'd like to do is, you already answered my, um, sort of, kind of answered my next question was, what have you learned that gives you meaning? And you pursue your interest and your projects and and from an entrepreneurial perspective as an author, um, does it shift over time, or is there like a central theme that is like your north star?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm somewhat rare as an author in that I don't just write about one subject. I don't have a niche that I write about over and over again, which in many ways has actually made my professional development harder. Because if I only wrote books about like branding or something, then it'd be a lot easier to just promote my work to the same audience over and over again. Instead, I write about whatever subject has captured my interest that I think there aren't enough books adequately explaining them, right? Um, but if you look, there definitely are central themes and areas of overlap between all the different topics I write about, and those things are things like enhancing self-actualization and self-expression, right?
Hmm.
I wrote a book about improving the way we teach English around the world as
Yes,
a foreign
I
language.
wanted you to talk
Yeah.
about that. Yes, please do.
So yeah, this one is called Our Global Lingua Franca: An Educator's Guide to Spreading English Where EFL Doesn't Work. Now, that is a very niche book because you have to either be a foreign English teacher, someone who's interested in becoming one, or at the very least, just someone who's very curious about how education works around the world, a linguist, or someone passionate about language. And so, someone who reads that might not necessarily have any interest in, like, the book I wrote about how to write books, or the book I wrote about economics in a post-Soviet world, right? There's like you might be interested in both those things, but there's no reason to necessarily think you would be, right? But if you think about it, both of those are very clearly addressing like inadequate education in the world, people's inability to communicate well and to understand how things work, social cohesion. That's one of the themes of why I think it's so important that we improve the way we teach English around the world, because English is the world's shared language. That's where the
Mm.
title comes from, our global lingua franca. A lingua franca is a language that's shared among different societies and cultures.
Oh.
English is the only one that applies on a global scale in that way. English
Mm.
is the only language you can expect to find in every country around the world to some degree. And I know this because I've been to a lot of countries around the world, and most of the time I was only speaking English. You cannot
Mm.
do that with any other language, not even some of the other major world languages like Spanish or Russian or Arabic. Certain parts of the world, certainly you could expect to find those, but never around the world like you can with
Mm.
English. So, what's the logical consequence of that? If you improve the way that people around the world learn English to at least a functional conversational degree, you're improving the degree to which the world can communicate and collaborate and
Mm.
solve its various problems and exchange and commerce and art and beauty and meaning and collaboration. And to me, like what's more important than that? Like that's addressing a huge lifelong timeless social issue that the human race has not overcome yet, and the ability to communicate is one very important part of that. It's obviously not the whole thing, but I mean that's why I wrote a book about teaching English. It's not just because I think teaching English is pretty cool and I have some experience with it, but because I'm addressing the larger macrocosmic problem underlying that makes that important.
That's that's really well put. Thank you very much. That was kind of the answer I was hoping for. And some of my guests don't understand what I'm trying to ask them, but you got it. So that's beautiful. What do you think in your history has made you want to help yourself with self-actualization as well as help others with self-actualization?
I was a very frustrated child.
Aw, aw,
Sure many of your listeners can relate to that.
probably. Yeah.
I always felt like the world was inadequate. I don't know how else to put it besides that. I know I grew up in a relatively privileged part of the world in a privileged position. I was never poor. I was never abused. I had many opportunities that most people don't have, and yet I always felt like it wasn't nearly enough.
Mm,
So I had this innate idealism in me, and I don't know exactly where it came from, but just I think it's just the ability to logically derive that things can be better than they are.
mm,
So why aren't they better? If
mm,
there is a better way to do things, why
right,
aren't we doing them?
right.
And whether that's something you've personally experienced, like what I was saying, the frustration of trying to show people, here's how economics works. If you followed these principles, you wouldn't be poor anymore as individuals or as a society. Because, of course, I've personally experienced that by coming from a developed nation, now living in a developing nation. I've personally seen that things can work much better than they currently are, or just things that you can logically infer. You can see, okay, no one has ever done it this way before. But can't you see that if we did it this way, things would be much better? Why aren't we doing it this way?
Yeah,
What's wrong with you people? Why can't you see this? And
yeah,
and you start to realize most people's brains don't work that way. It's
yeah,
relatively it's an exceptional minority of people who can think that way and
yeah,
have the wherewithal to try to actualize this better way of things in the world through their actions.
yeah. It's true. So I love where we are right now, but I have my questions, and I'm like trying to decide whether I can go into interesting, more detailed conversation or stick to my question. I think we can come back to this.
Okay.
Um, to ask you, do you prefer self-study or classes more, or is it a mix?
If I could find educators I trusted, which does happen rarely, Um, very rarely I will find an author or a lecturer or even just some guy making video essays on YouTube or something, and I will lock into them and say I want to consume everything they've produced. The most recent would probably be a relatively unknown author and lecturer who was very active in the 1960s in California named Andrew Galambos, who lectured extensively on like the nature of society and how to use the scientific method to understand social sciences and the source of social problems in ways that few other people can begin to understand. Similar to what I was saying about Isaac Asimov, he just had this way of organizing very complex, nuanced subjects in this very logical way where it made complete sense the way he explained it. And when
Wow,
I find someone like that, I become an information sponge for them. It's like our minds are linked. The way he explains things is perfectly suited to the way I learn things. So when
wow,
I can find someone like that, it's like it's a rare blessing in my life, and I hold on
yeah,
to it.
yeah,
But with most subjects, that simply isn't feasible, and I have to be my own teacher because I just can't find someone who can teach at the level I learn at. I know how arrogant that sounds, but that's just honestly how I feel.
mm, cool. Um, what you mentioned one of the challenges that you deal with is that finding teachers or mentors who teach at the level that you learn at is one of your challenges, I would assume. But do you have other challenges that you need to overcome, and what's holding you back?
I don't think it's a personal thing anymore. Most of the people I've known who have a lot of potential, particularly in a society like Armenia, where I am, I've known a lot of really bright young people, just in terms of raw intelligence and ability. And they have emotional limitations that stop them from fully using their potential. A lot of it is culturally derived. They need to live up to the expectations of their parents, of the school, of their society. And it kind of breaks my heart to see them not become everything they're capable of being because of that.
Mm,
And that made me stop and think on why didn't I ever have that problem? Why was I never afraid of what other people thought of me or wanted me to be? Why didn't I have those kinds of emotional limitations? I think what most people need is a mentor, not just in the intellectual sense, but the emotional one to inspire them to stop being afraid of the things they're afraid of and be more confident about pursuing their own interests because they trust their own ability, their own assessment of things.
mm.
And for me, that's just never been an issue. I don't know. It's like I, again, I'm aware that to many people this must sound very arrogant, like I'm a narcissist or something. I think I'm like the smartest, greatest person who's ever lived or something. But rather, it was just I had this innate sense of trust in my mind that I could figure out what made sense and what didn't, while making a lot of mistakes along the way. But through that personal experimentation, that chaotic stage you have to go through, if your mind is sufficiently capable and you can understand when things are coherent, when they're consistent, when they match reality, and when they don't, you very quickly start to filter through all the bullshit that most people live by.
Mm,
And why do I trust that? Well, because I see that it's logical, and logic, reason, the ability to be rational has to be the ultimate arbiter of truth. Does
mm,
this logically make sense or not? If
mm,
it doesn't matter what people around me think. It doesn't matter if everyone in the world thinks something. It's not logical. It doesn't stand up to scrutiny. It doesn't
mm,
match reality. And that's, I think, the only way we ever do make breakthroughs. Some individual person figures out that the way everybody thinks about something doesn't make sense. And they
mm,
spend their entire lives trying to communicate and convince those few people capable of understanding there are things called germs that exist that are making everyone
yeah,
sick. I figured it out, guys. I swear to God, the way you're thinking about it doesn't make sense. That's why people keep dying unnecessarily. And
yeah.
slowly over the course of generations, that new idea, because it does stand up to logical and scientific scrutiny, starts to grow, expand, and eventually everybody accepts it as the obvious truth. Yeah, of course there are germs. What else would there be, right? But
So
you
I
forget
have
that for
kind of
most
a
of human history,
personal
people didn't get
question.
that.
Oh, I
Yeah?
apologize. I have a personal question. Have you, you seem like a very left dominant, I know that's not quite correct anymore. I understand that. But the logical reasoning, you know, analytical
Hmm.
mind, and I bet it's
Yeah.
like razor sharp. Um, but do you ever do, do you ever struggle with the intuitive side of yourself, or do they work in harmony like in many musicians?
Well, I am a musician. It's
Oh,
interesting that
okay.
you bring
I
that
didn't
up.
know that.
Well, I'm
Uh,
more than that, I'm a music educator. One of my first jobs was music teaching, which I still do to
oh,
some degree here.
cool.
We bring the neighboring kids over to play the piano or the guitar or some other instruments I have. And even when I was a teenager, I kind of realized it's not that I'm like the best guitarist in the world, but I was really good at explaining how the instrument worked to people in ways that most other teachers couldn't do, right? Like people used to tell me that in their first lesson with me, they learned more than 3 months with their last teacher. And again,
Ah,
it wasn't because I was the best player. Look how fast I can play. Look at these incredibly difficult guitar solos I can play or something. But I had a schematic of how things worked and I was able to verbally express that very well to other people.
mm.
So when you ask questions about things like intuition, what is intuition?
So I was referring to, I don't know if you're familiar with Ian McGilchrist, the Master and the Emissary.
No.
Um, he talks about how the Western society, Western culture, it can include Europe and stuff, it's very dominated by the left side of the hemisphere, meaning the logical reasoning, um, analytical side of our brain,
Mm-hmm.
where we downplay and dismiss the intuitive side of our minds, the one that is not verbal, it's more
Mm-hmm.
um, intuitive, it's more artistic, it understands symbology and is able to make
Mm-hmm.
connections between words and symbols that we aren't able to articulate. It it's more like this. It's not the subconscious, but it because it's not as articulate as the left side of our brain. Um, it, he's starting to realize that we have a lack of being that we neglect the right side of the brain, the more intuitive side of the brain, and we focus heavily on the left side of the brain, the more logical and reasoning side, to the detriment, because they're supposed to work in opponent processing,
Mm-hmm.
and supposed to help each other. And it sounds like they do that in your mind. especially with your music background. And um, one of the reason why I asked, I wasn't trying to trick you or anything. It's just the way
You can try to
I was
trick me.
thinking. I'm not very good at it, but um, is one of the challenges. It sounds like is you're having trouble convincing people that I think I figured out the answers. Here, look at them. And people are rejecting it for different reasons, and you may not be able to persuade them and uh, connect with them on a heart-to-heart level, even though you're trying to bridge the gap brain to brain. If that makes
Uh huh.
sense.
So, yes, I
And
think I
it's
see what you're saying.
yeah, and it might not be accurate because you know I have a snippet of time with you right now, and it just that's what I'm wondering, and it could be the cultural divide. You might be in a collectivist society where we come from an individualistic society.
Hmm.
That could be the dynamic going on as well.
It's definitely part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you talk about intuition, I think you're mostly talking about largely unconscious or implicit understanding of things.
Implicit, yes.
Yes. And obviously, that's part of everyone's mind, that our mind builds associations, whether coherently or incoherently, reasonably or irreasonably. Like when you think of things like irrational fears and traumas,
Mm-hmm.
the mind has built an association in some way of terror, of danger, of insecurity, sometimes in ways that make sense, like if you're afraid of spiders because a spider might actually hurt you and like poison you and kill you with a bite, or
Yeah.
most of the time though they don't actually pose much threat, but you might have some kind of panic response because somehow your mind is built an association of harm and terror with something that's actually not particularly threatening to you, right?
Right.
um, so that would be a form of intuition, one that doesn't really stand up to logical scrutiny, right? Because you should be able to explain to people like this
Unless you're
this
in
little.
Australia. Like,
Yes, like I said, there are some situations where it does make sense,
yeah, like
right?
you said that. Yes, I heard you.
Right.
Yeah.
But certainly for most people, most of the time, a spider living in the corner of your ceiling isn't actually posing any threat to you, right? And logically, if you have a base level of intelligence, you should be able to explain that to someone. It's like you don't need to be freaking out about this harmless little thing here, right? You may not like it for aesthetic reasons, but it's not going to
Right.
hurt you, right?
Right.
But people with irrational fears who've built some kind of intuitive association cannot reason their way out of that position. Right?
Mm.
They just do not have that level of control over their unconscious emotional responses, right? So ideally, our intuition would be complemented by our intellect. There should be nothing that we intuitively understand or associate that shouldn't be able to be logically, rationally explained in a coherent way, right? I happen to be someone who's very good at that, right? The question worth asking is there a detriment to that? Am I limited in some way because I focus so much on the explicit, the conscious, and the logical and rational, right? I don't know. You tell me. Like, am
I
I
don't
missing
know.
something by
I
being
think we
so
all have.
obsessed with
Oh, go ahead. I
that kind of
apologize.
understanding? No, go ahead.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I apologize. Um, I I'm just thinking out loud. I'm not, you know, trying to debate you or anything like that. Um, I think
Feel
we
free
all
to.
have strengths and weaknesses. Um, and I I try to. I have one dear friend who's read the classics and she's into sports and she's kind of a salt of the earth person. She likes what I do and stuff like that, but she's not attracted to learning stuff, even though she's done college stuff to increase her degrees and that kind of stuff. Um, but uh, and help her get a job in the future. She's very, you know, rock solid, kind of person. And, and like you said, it's like I can't seem to get her interested in like learning something just for the fun of it.
Okay.
So I do a personal experience with coming against that roadblock of like this would help you make have more joy and life in your life, but
Mm-hmm.
she has a different makeup than I do internally, and I don't know how to communicate that well with her. I have a different personality to her. I'm high in openness. She's high in
Mm-hmm.
conscientiousness, and that tends to be
Uh-huh.
you know the big by personality traits. And higher in conscientiousness, usually the lower in openness you are, and
Right.
the
Or
higher in
neuroticism.
Yeah, and neuroticism, you're high in neuroticism. I ironically am low in neuroticism. I have no idea why. I'm thankful, but I probably could use more emotion. That'd probably be good. But yeah. Um, so I think we kind of covered this. The next question is what the internal and external problems you face, and you deal with the actual culture of Armenia and your locality and the collectivist society, the traditionalism, the trying to live up to expectations, not take risks, risk avoidance culture
Hmm.
maybe. Um,
A lot of it is shame too. Like, what will people
mm,
think of me if I try something and I fail?
mm,
That's a huge motivator here. Everybody's terrified of what everyone else will think of them.
mm,
Again, not a problem I've ever had, but so it's really, honestly, it's hard for me to like empathize with that. I
mm,
try to, like, I'm not trying to sound like I'm totally diminishing that, like it doesn't matter. I'm trying to
right.
put myself in their position, like try to imagine what it must be like to care so much what people think. And
Mm,
because it's just not an experience I've ever really directly had. So maybe that's one way in which I'm limited.
mm, yeah.
You mentioned the Big Five,
Yeah.
which I have taken the Big Five test. And what I found particularly interesting is that in most aspects, I ranked either exceptionally high or exceptionally low.
Interesting.
Yeah, like I was a 99 in openness to experience, meaning I'm more open to experience than 99% of people.
Wow.
And I was a 2 in orderliness.
Oh.
So that means I am less orderly than 98% of people, which
Oh
again
my
sounds like
goodness.
a bad thing, right?
Yeah. It's
But
yeah.
think about what that means. It means that I don't require things to be ordered in a particular way to function, which is
Yeah.
another way of saying I'm extremely adaptable, right?
Yeah.
Which makes a lot of sense that I'm someone who thrived very well traveling around the world, living out of a suitcase, constantly throwing myself into new social settings
Mm.
because I was open to new experiences
Yeah.
and I didn't need things to be a certain way in order to function. I
You
adapted
you
very
can go
well,
with the
right?
flow.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's helpful. Yeah.
Right. So
Wow.
there,
That's
yeah,
fascinating.
yeah, it's just a really weird combination of personality traits I have that have made me well suited for a particular way of interacting with the world.
Yeah. It's fascinating. I learned about it to a Canadian psychologist and took the online class he did online test that he had. He
Jordan
moderated a little
Peterson?
bit. Peterson, yes,
Yeah, yeah, I took his test too.
and
Yeah.
he the understandmyself.com thing, and I learned I was I always thought I was either a borderline or partially introverted person. And the Big Five taught me that no, I'm actually high in like 96 or 98 percentile extroversion.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I just the problem is most of the tests, including the Myers Briggs and all the others, they they the the questions testing for extroversion asked you if you like loud
Yeah.
crowds and big crowds and loud party kind of things, and I don't because I'm hard of hearing. So I was like always saying no to those, and so that's why they always put me at the borderline.
Yeah.
And then
They're
when
conflating things that don't really
yeah,
belong.
and
Yeah.
and so because people thrive on the energy of those kind of things, but for me it's like it's deafening, and I can't function. I like being with my group of friends, but I don't like the noise of big restaurants and stuff kind of make it hard for me to function. I'm like, okay, so that was very enlightening to me. I'm like, that's
Mm-hmm.
why I like talking to people so much. Like, oh, okay, this is helpful. It was the first test that actually gave me clarity on that, and then learning that um, I was low in neuroticism. I was moderate in something. I can't remember exactly volatility, and
Mm-hmm.
I was uh, really low on something. No, I was really low in volatility, and there was another one, withdraw,
Mm-hmm.
withdraw or face something. I can't remember which subtrait that was, but I withdrew from conflict a lot, and so I was conflict avoidant, and, and
I
so
was
that so
extremely low
those
in
two things, the
agreeableness.
extroversion and then the conflict avoidance things, were coloring the extroversion and
Hmm.
introversion things of the other test, and I didn't know it. So I thought that was really interesting and insightful. I'm like, oh, finally, I understand what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So that was kind of cool.
So
So,
what I was just saying about my inability to empathize with people who care a lot about like what people think of them,
mm,
that's a form of agreeableness. Like
yes,
seeking social harmony and cohesion is a high priority, is
right,
agreeable. Is essentially like typically women are higher in that than men, which has a lot of interesting implications. Jordan Peterson, I think, even said once that he thinks that's one reason why there's still a wage gap between men and women. It's not because like people just discriminate against women, but because women are less likely to like argue and negotiate for a raise. They're more likely to just accept whatever is given to them because they value social harmony and cohesion. Whereas a disagreeable
right,
person, which men are more likely to be, are going to say, you know what? No, let's do it this way. Like I don't care what you think.
yeah.
I think I'm a one in agreeableness. So I'd have to
Oh,
check again,
wow.
which means
Okay.
yeah, I'm extremely disagreeable. What does that mean? Does that mean I'm an asshole who just likes to argue
No,
with people?
no. It
No,
means that you're very firm and
right.
counter stuff. And we
That's
need
another way of
disagreeable
saying like
people.
principled, right? Like that if I believe
Yeah,
something is right, I'm going to defend it to the death and I don't give a shit what you think of me.
right. Exactly. Yeah. That's really cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, uh, what problems have you dealt with successfully and how did you solve them?
Where should I begin with such a question? Problems. World's full of
Wherever,
problems.
one thing I forgot to say before we started it, if I ask you anything that's too personal you don't want to share,
Oh, I
just skip
no.
the question. I'm not trying
I
to
have no
probe any.
shame, remember?
Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Uh, so I have a friend who's a psychotherapist. Actually, she wrote the foreword to my latest book, The Romantic Ideal, which is about
Mm.
concepts of romance and how men and women, masculine and feminine people experience them differently. And she wrote the foreword from a very feminine perspective. And I asked her to diagnose me once what she thought is
Oh.
a professional psychotherapist if I have some kind of personality disorder or why I am the way I am. And the most she told me was that it just seems like I don't really have any boundaries or borders, like where
Oh.
most people would very quickly either intuit or explicitly say like here are things that are appropriate to say and do, here are things that are not. I'm just kind of completely an open book. I'm completely transparent, which sounds like a good thing, right? But also it has the potential to make other people very uncomfortable because I will talk about things or do things in a way that they've accepted shouldn't be done.
Mm.
Like you shouldn't talk about very personal things or your sex life or weight or your fundamental religious or political beliefs or something. And I don't really seem to have those filters, those boundaries where I will just talk about anything simply because they're true and I think they're important. Why shouldn't I talk about them unless someone has explicitly said they don't want to talk about those things? Then it would just be rude to disregard that they don't want to talk about those things, right?
Mm.
But but otherwise, I just what's the trait for that openness, right? That I just
Yeah. It's
all it's all
probably
just
openness. Yeah.
information to me.
Yeah.
And we assign emotional value to information, but unless we have some kind of emotional trauma that we haven't fully integrated, why should we be unwilling to talk about these things and share this information if it's useful information? So I'm saying don't worry about asking me personal questions,
Okay.
essentially.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I have some things I don't want to talk about online, but
Okay,
we're not even going there, so don't worry
sure.
about it. But but um, what with all your experience and your knowledge, what were some problems that you were able to solve and deal with successfully, and how did you solve them?
Well, moving here was brought on a series of logistical problems I was not anticipating. To a rural location at a village called Calavan, which, by the way, you can check out if you go to our website, calavan.net, Kalavan. Um, I bought this really large old house in a huge state of disrepair, and I have no practical experience in construction or refurbishing. And so when I showed up here, not speaking the local Armenian language, not really having any strong social connections here, and not having any experience in this domain, that's when I kind of have to go into super adapter mode. How do I solve this series of problems? Well, I have to learn basic building techniques. I have to buy a bunch of tools. I have to start to somehow make connections with people who have the skills and knowledge that I don't. I have to find a way to communicate with them because most of them don't speak English and I don't speak Armenian, right? So there's this very clear priority of problems that I have to solve, and I have to solve them in a way that makes sense and is easiest for me to solve them, right?
Mm.
And so now, 5 years later, the house is in this beautiful, nice, modern condition. We're bringing in volunteers from all over the world who want to come stay here, and we've built a name for ourselves among the locals. We've been interviewed on the local news several times, and for better or worse, positive or negative, people seem to know who we are. How did I solve all those problems besides just being a good learner and a generally intelligent person? Because I was very determined, because I saw it as very important. I was unwilling to compromise. I took a strong pride in ownership. I said, this is my house. I bought it. I've made it my home. I moved in here even when it was in terrible condition and there wasn't even plumbing or electricity or a heater installed.
Oof.
So, so you just, it's like moving out into the jungle or something. Like
Mm.
you have to solve the basic hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
Survival first. Okay, it's getting cold in winter, so I need a simple wood stove where I can burn firewood and keep warm. I need water. I need a toilet. I built a composting toilet that doesn't require any water, just out of materials I had lying around and looking a few things up online.
Cool.
Um, like so what do? You have a problem, you need a way to solve it. What's logically the easiest way to solve it? How do I feed myself? How do I go to the bathroom? How do I bathe? How do I stay warm in winter? And eventually you work your way up to a nice modern house with all the luxuries that we're used to in the West. And that's the state we're at now. Now we're building an expansion behind the house. We're always thinking of new things to add to the property, and it's very cool to have gone through that kind of prolonged experience over the course of about 5 years, to go from the very primitive to now the modern and sophisticated, right?
Yeah.
Very few people ever get the chance to do that. Either they live in very primitive conditions or they live in very modern conditions, but they never really see the chain of causality between those two extreme states.
Right. Wow, that's cool. Thank you.
That's the entrepreneurial mentality I talk about, right? That
Yeah.
it takes an entrepreneurial way of thinking to think, okay, how can I create something that doesn't exist yet? How can I logically infer what the next thing to do is?
So one of the big things that was helpful for you was the internet, probably
Definitely.
having access to the internet to be able to like figure out how to do all that stuff from ground zero on up.
Sure. Or even just managing other people, like my construction master, one of my neighbors. He's been doing basic Soviet style construction his whole life. He's about 50 years old, so he definitely knows what he's doing in a particular way. But then I'd show him YouTube videos of people building things in a way he's never seen before, speaking English while they do it. And I'd say to him, hey, could you do it this way? And he'd kind of look at it for a while. He says, okay, yeah, I see why that makes sense. Okay, but how do I do that? I've never done that before. And I say, okay, well, I'll look it up and I'll explain it to you in Armenian to the best of my ability. And
Oh
because
wow.
he was an uncommonly open-minded person, particularly in this culture where most people are not open-minded, even through the language barrier, with things he's never done before, he could figure out, yeah, okay, I could see why that makes sense. Let's try it that way. And he kind of got excited about trying it in a way he's never done before, because
Yeah.
it's interesting when you do things one way for 50 years, suddenly like you're confronted with a new way to do things. Either you can find that very threatening and confusing, or you can approach it like a curious child. Say, okay,
Yeah.
huh, that seems interesting. Let's try it and see what happens, right?
Yeah, that's cool. That's very, very cool. Wow. Um, what were some of the other resources or types of tools or things that you found that were helpful during your journey of going from zero to modern house thing? Or
Well, it
even in your
helps.
writing, you know,
Yeah.
too.
I think it's a question of whether the information exists or you have to invent it from scratch. With things
Ah,
like building or refurbishing a house, that information already exists, right? Even with the unconventional techniques, like we just used a technique called earth bag building to build some walls behind the house,
oh,
which it's common in some countries, but certainly not here. It's where you fill nylon bags full of dirt, kind of like a sandbag, and lay them together in such a way that they're like giant bricks of dirt. essentially, and it's
Oh,
actually a very stable way to build if you do it correctly, and it's fireproof and earthquake proof. But just no one's ever done that here, just because it's
wow.
not the way they learn to build. It's actually very cheap too, because you need very few materials. At least it's fairly labor intensive, but you don't need to spend a lot of money on building materials. And so something like that, again, I've never done it, but I can very quickly read books about it. I can watch videos about it and say, okay, this is how they do that. Let's try doing that, right? Or more traditional construction techniques that obviously there's plenty of existing information on. So once you know the information exists, you simply need to ask, what's the most convenient way for me to consume that information? Can I watch videos about it? Can I read books about it? Can I explain it to other people who are doing most of the actual construction work, who have more practical experience but have never been exposed to this type of information before? So
Mm,
because that's one of my particular strengths, I'm a good learner and a good teacher, that worked out well.
mm,
But if you're doing something where there isn't really information widely available about how to solve that problem, then you need to be a good experimenter. You need to be kind of a scientist. You need to be willing to figure things out through trial and error, and logically figure out why something works or doesn't, right?
mm.
So if the information exists, where do you find it? How do you most conveniently consume it? And if it doesn't exist, how do you figure it out yourself? And if you do figure something out yourself, then maybe you should share that information with other people. Maybe you should write a book about it, or make a
Right.
YouTube video about it, or whatever
Yeah.
medium makes
I
most
mean,
sense
you
for you.
wrote books on some of the answers to resources to how to teach English better, to be an
Mm-hmm.
entrepreneur, and the others, and the writer. How to be. I was drawn to the title because I just written the book, or yeah, just written the book, uh, Writer the Meaning, and I'm like, I want to write something that has depth to it. I'm not, I'm not a great thinker, you know, I'm not
Mm-hmm.
Albert Einstein or anything like that, but I was like, I like a little bit of depth, and I don't want to make slock. And I thought, well, you would probably have really good advice on that, and speaking from your own personal experience. What were some of the things that um, you saw in the I'll ask you about the other books. There's the actually teaching English, and also
Mm-hmm.
the entrepreneur book. What were some of the things that you talk about in those books that are tools that are helpful that you explain more in depth in the book?
Well, pretty much every book I've written has in some way been the result of me being frustrated with the quality of books already available on a
Mm,
subject,
mm,
which is good, right? Because it means I'm going to write something that no one has written before, right? Instead of just reproducing the same content over and over again. And similar to what I was saying about, like, now that I want to write a science fiction book about subjects I'm not an expert in, right? So I have to make sure that what I'm thinking makes sense to the people who are experts, right? I had a lot of practical experience as a foreign English teacher, because that was one job I took in various countries around the world. I'm obviously very passionate about language and communication, and I understand, of course, like the grammar of the language quite well. Um, and so it kind of starts with a hypothesis or a theory. Like to me, here's what I've observed in every country I've taught English in. There's always the same shortcomings show up everywhere, which is kind of fascinating if you think about
mm.
it. Why would people in South America be making the same mistakes as people in East Asia? It doesn't
Oh,
make sense.
interesting.
Like they don't share the same school curriculum, they don't share the same culture, that so why would they all be making the same mistakes? And so you start to look into that more beyond just my incidental experience teaching in about a dozen countries or so, which isn't that much in the grand scheme of things. It's more than most people, but considering there are 200 countries in the world, like maybe that's just a fluke. Maybe it's not that way in all the other countries I haven't been to. But if you look into it more and you start to ask other people who have had other experiences, you start to see a pattern emerge. And so then you start to ask why. Why is everyone doing this in this suboptimal way that really obviously doesn't produce results? Like, if people can take years and years of English classes and still barely be able to have a conversation in English with you, I don't think you need to be a linguist to see that there's a problem there. In the
Mm,
same way that if you spent years and years learning how to build a house and every house you ever built fell over, well, I
right.
don't need to be a master construction worker to see there's something wrong with the way you're building houses, right? There
Right.
should be
Yeah.
some basic level of competence that
Yeah.
you've acquired there, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what I saw. And if you read the introduction to that book, you'll see I'm saying, like, why is it that we all keep doing this in a way that demonstrably does not produce adequate results. And every English teacher I have shown the book to, no matter where they're practicing, they'll say, yeah, you've perfectly described that that's how we teach English, and the frustrations and the problems I see with everyone I teach English to. How did you know that? And I said, well, actually, I've never been to the country you teach in, but this is what I saw in every country I taught it, and everyone I talked to said the same goddamn things. So I'm building kind of this working theory of the model of how everyone teaches English. And I start to read all the academic books that people write and read for how we're supposed to teach English. And again, I see the same patterns and the same shortcomings over and over again. And so I start to basically just codify these things and explain, here is how everybody learns to teach English. This is how almost everybody teaches English in a formal capacity. And here is almost always the result of that. Are you logical enough, and do you trust your own judgment enough, like I do, to see that there's a problem with this, that
Yeah.
it's not working? Okay, so once you've established that you agree that there is a problem, what's the solution, right? Logically, what would make more sense to do? And then we start to go into more, well, we should learn more through immersion instead of rote memorization. Like, you shouldn't just
Mm.
memorize a bunch of English words to pass a test. Instead, you should start using English for practical, functional things as quickly as possible. And then we go into lots of details of how to do that, right? And all of it is extremely logical. You don't need to have any experience in linguistics or language teaching to see why this makes sense. Obviously, it helps if you do. And if you've actually tried putting this into practice, you'll see more and more why it works or the frustrations that come with trying to do it this way. But it's all very straightforward and very obvious, even to non linguists, right?
Mm.
And so I wrote that book because I didn't see that kind of information being shared virtually anywhere, whether
Mm.
in book form or in podcasts or whatever. And it feels like you're going a bit crazy because it's like the first guy to figure out that germs exist. Like, it seems so
Yeah.
obvious to you once you figure it out, but you can't. No one else is talking about this. Why? What is wrong with people? How am I the first person in the world to figure this out? Again, it feels
Mm.
quite arrogant because it's like somebody else should have figured this out by now. There are 8
Right.
billion people on the planet, and I'm not the world's most competent linguist or language teacher, right? Like,
Yeah.
someone else must have figured this out before me. But
Yeah.
it just doesn't seem like they have, or at the very least, they haven't written a book about it.
Or they might not be visible. They might not be, you know.
Yeah, maybe they're ignored, right?
Yeah. So that's kind of sad. But that's really kind of helpful. Um, this question is probably too generic for you. But I'll ask it anyhow and just see
Okay.
what you might say. Um, what have you learned that you found helpful? Because you talked a lot about different things that you did learn, from construction stuff to uh, learning different languages to learning how to communicate, learning music. You know,
Yeah,
you can go
okay.
anywhere with this.
So that is quite a generic question. I will
Yeah,
interpret that as, what have I learned that is most helpful? That's much more specific.
yeah. I can amend
Any
my question in the future.
Right. Any true information is potentially helpful. It obviously depends, though, on what your goals are, right? You have to want to
Right.
do something in order for information to be useful for you, just because it's true. Like, I don't know advanced chemistry, and I don't have any particular use for that in my life right now. But maybe I would someday if I bothered to learn it. Maybe I'd start some kind of laboratory here in my house and synthesize new chemicals someday. Who knows? But right now, at the very least, I don't see any particular need for that. But I also didn't see any particular need for learning construction before I moved into a house that needed refurbishing, right? So it's
Mm.
contextual and it's subjective, right? Um, Probably the most useful information I have found is learning about the basics of human behavior, which includes things like economics, which is the kind of thing I think most people don't think of as a practical skill. It's like a theoretical thing you learn. But when you
Yeah.
think about like what economics is, it's kind of the science of how human beings make choices to pursue their own goals, which
Interesting.
encompasses everything we ever buy or sell. That's a subset of that. Anytime you spend money or someone spends money with you, you make money from someone. Why are they doing that? They're
Right.
pursuing a goal in a rational fashion, right?
Right.
They have a desired outcome. They want something, and they're trying to accomplish it in the most efficient way that they know how. Which doesn't mean that they're always right, because people are not always smart. They don't always have everything they need to do things in the optimal way. But from their perspective, they're doing it the best way they know how. Everyone is always seeking the maximum possible gains and the least possible losses, which are subjective things. Again, it depends what you care about, what makes you happy, what makes you sad. But that's really the science of economics, right? And it's so much broader and more detailed and nuanced than just like the price of things in a marketplace, right?
Right.
That's just one consequence of those things, right?
Right. You're
And it
taking
really,
a meta view of everything instead of just the micro view of
right.
the the little things, the pulleys and stuff. You're like up here looking at the grand scheme of stuff.
Yeah, the origin of it is supply and demand. But think about what that means. Again, it's not just some like theoretical abstract concept. It's how you make choices.
Mm,
Supply is what you perceive as available to pursue the things you want. Demand is the things you know you want.
mm,
That's it. That's an individual process that happens in the consciousness of every person, right? Again, it's
mm,
not something out there in an abstract numerical fashion, which is how we usually think of economics. It's something happening here with every conscious choice you ever make and every conscious choice every other individual ever makes. Supply
mm,
and demand is happening here all the time, even right now in this conversation. You and I
right.
both agreed to have this conversation because, in some form, we both demanded it. We both perceived that it would be valuable for us as individuals in a
Yeah.
subjective fashion to get something we both wanted. And our
Yeah.
wants overlapped in such a way that here we are having this conversation right now,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly.
And every other choice is competing with every other choice, if for no other reason than because there are only 24 hours in a day. So if
Right.
I spend an hour having this conversation with you, it means it's an hour I didn't spend on something else. That's called opportunity cost, right?
Right.
Hour 15 minutes so far, 16
Yeah.
minutes.
Yeah.
And so I had to in some way subjectively evaluate how I perceived this conversation would happen, because obviously I had to make the choice before the conversation happened. I had to make an assumption, a prediction about what would happen in the conversation, and
Mm,
decide that this is a better way for me to spend this hour and 16 minutes than what else I would have been doing with this hour and 16 minutes otherwise, right?
yeah. Exactly.
That's a form of supply, right?
Right.
That's a way of thinking of what are the options available for me to accomplish my subjective goals.
Yeah. Cool. I really appreciate that. That's helpful. I've never thought of economics that way before, and that was very enlightening. I
Mm-hmm.
kind of half knew it, but you articulated it so
It
well.
yeah, it
So
just seems obvious, right?
yeah,
Like,
it's
but
like
until somebody explains it to you, or really, it's a way of like giving permission. Like, I'm telling you, it's okay for you to think of it this way, even though you
right.
probably could have derived it on your own. Maybe you just didn't have the confidence. You said, "Well, the experts always talk about it this way, so they must
Yeah.
know more than I do," right?
Yeah, it's kind of like how, like, for me, Jordan Peterson articulated some stuff. Like, I really liked his biblical lecture series. As a Christian,
Mm-hmm.
I was like, I've never heard anybody talk about the Bible from a psychological perspective before. That was really enlightening. And the whole thing about,
Mythology, right?
I'm sorry?
Mythology too. He talks about religion in a
Yeah, he does,
mythological
yes.
sense. Yeah.
And, um, and in his biblical lecture series, he talks about Cain and Abel. And it's only a few paragraphs, but the he talks about bitterness and resentment, and it just made so much more sense than what I grew up with as a kid. I'm like, oh, and so you found that with some of the other people that Asimov, I apologize, my
Asimov,
Asimov and the other gentlemen,
Galambos.
they were explaining things, and you're like, you're explaining it so well,
Yeah,
articulating something that I kind of half kind of was semi aware of, but never knew how to articulate.
right.
And so that was kind of cool.
And once you have that confidence, because someone whose opinion you trust,
Hmm.
or just how clearly they lay things out for you, it's like, okay, I feel confident now accepting that as a working model for things, and
Right.
it will replace my old working model. And still now, every time I interact with someone who uses the old outdated working model, I can kind of disregard what they're saying because I know that I'm using a superior model. Even if
Right.
99% of other people use this weird outdated suboptimal model for how this particular subject works, I trust that my relatively rare model works better. It is superior, and I will continue to use it.
Yeah. Cool. I'd like to talk more about your experience. Um, how are you doing on time? Would
I'm fine.
you fine so we can keep going a little while longer?
Yes, I'm okay with the opportunity cost of investing more time into this conversation in the pursuit of my subjective values.
Okay, sounds great. um, that was nicely woven. Um, So I want to give you an opportunity to tell your story more in depth of like the school in Armenia and the
Mm-hmm.
village and what's happening now and what's going on, and kind of give a spotlight to how did you come up with the idea, or how did it originate, and then where is it now and what's happening there?
Yeah, well,
That's a
uh,
lot. I apologize.
it is a lot. um, Again, it's not the kind of thing I could have predicted. I just kind of had to adapt to the situation I was in. In many ways, I made certain decisions and certain commitments based on bad information. Because, as I was said, originally the reason I chose this village, I was kind of looking for a place to settle down, retire in a sense, like just stop nomading around from country to country and just invest myself in one place. And this village was being publicly promoted by local politicians as wanting to economically develop the village, teach entrepreneurship and business skills to the locals, all things that align very strongly with my skills and my values, right? So I felt like, okay, this is a place where I could make a home and be valued for my contribution to the community. And um, what I failed to anticipate, and realistically, I probably couldn't have anticipated, so I don't beat myself up over the mistake too much because it's really not the kind of thing I could have known ahead of time. Is that um, politicians are very manipulative and dishonest people, which just kind of seems like a general truism, but the level to which they have gone to misrepresent this village and the efforts they're taking in this village is an absurd thing that realistically I couldn't have predicted. Like they've taken hundreds of thousands of dollars in grant money from organizations like USAID to build these big, modern, impressive community centers that haven't been used in the 5 years they've been built,
Oh,
for
wow.
instance. Or they'll stock their school library with many thousands of dollars worth of English language books, and nobody in the school can speak English.
Oh, wow.
Why are they doing that? Well, we could say that maybe it's just money laundering or something. Like that's certainly a possibility that they just take lots of money and keep some for themselves and act like they're spending it on important things. But I think the root of the problem really is that they can't really tell the difference between appearances and realities.
Mm,
Because if you build a big expensive community center, if you have a big impressive library full of books, you've created the appearance, the narrative of social progress, right?
mm.
And that's all that matters to them. They cannot
Okay.
tell the difference between that story and actually doing the things that are implied by that story. The
Huh.
implication of having a big expensive community center is that lots of community activities are happening there. The implication of having a big expansive library is that lots of people are reading those books and learning important things and expanding the minds of the children, but they're not actually doing those things because they
Ah.
cannot differentiate between those two things.
Mm.
Like a proper psychologist could make a whole career out of just studying this one phenomenon. And that's
Wow.
kind of the problem with being a generalist,
Mm.
which I guess I am because I don't specialize in any one particular domain, is that I can see the potential for someone who really, really specialized in this area to really do an in-depth study and come to some amazing conclusions. I'm not in a position to do that. I can only begin the process and comment on these things and to an extent document these things, which I've done. I've kind of become, in a sense, a whistleblower in calling attention to these things that I'm in a position to. And lots of people either don't believe me because it just seems so absurd, right?
Mm.
Like it does sound like an absurd thing to do, but there's proof. I can see it. I live here. I see it every day that I'm here. And others have started to investigate these things and wonder, okay, what are we doing wrong as a country that this is our standard of progress? That we're not actually accomplishing any of the useful humanitarian things we're talking about. We're just telling a really appealing sounding story. I've
Ah.
described Armenia as a pre truth society. And
Interesting.
yeah, what I mean by that is that they have not yet matured to a point as a civilization where they understand that there is a difference between what they think and what is really happening. And eventually, reality catches up to them, and they will suffer the economic and interpersonal consequences of failing to tell the truth, of failing
Mm.
to hold themselves to the standard of what's really going on.
Wow.
That's a major philosophical breakthrough that often goes underestimated, that there is reality, and there's what you think about reality. And those
Right.
two are not the same thing.
Right.
And your duty as an intellectually honest person, as a virtuous person who cares about actually making things better, is to align your thoughts as closely as possible with the objective reality that is happening and will continue to happen no matter what you think about it.
Right. Yeah. And that's hard because we have a prejudice and biases and all that stuff. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure those of us in America still have issues with that.
Of course, this is
Yeah.
this is part of the human condition, right? It's
Yeah.
not unique to Armenia at all. It's just particularly obvious in this context that I'm in,
Mm.
right? If you
Yeah.
actually want to make social progress, you need to confront uncomfortable truths sometimes.
Yeah.
And there are people who get offended and pissed off at someone like me when I say, hey, by the way, these things you keep talking about aren't true. Because when you have this really appealing sounding story, look at all the wonderful things we're doing for the children of the village. And then here's this one foreigner showing up saying, actually, none of that is true. They're not actually doing any of those things. A lot of people get really mad at someone like me for being the person to say those things, right? Because they prefer the story. They prefer to believe that these things are happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So what? So you. So you kind of. You're there under misunderstanding and false pretenses and all this kind of stuff, but you decided to stay anyway because this is
Yes.
your house. You're going to make it work. You're going to build something that's nice. And then once you got the home figured out, you somehow started your own little academy thing. Can you, what's the story behind that?
Well, a lot changed when I started focusing on international people instead of the local Armenians. It just became almost impossible to get anything done with the locals, with some
Oh.
noteworthy exceptions, such as I said with my neighbor who does most of the construction on my house, but he's an exception. But I realized I didn't have to focus on those people. I can focus on types of people other people in this country wouldn't. And in a way, that's contributing to a lot of progress here, just bringing in people from other countries, either travelers passing through the country or people who want to immigrate here, and giving them a place to live, a place to learn, a place to develop in ways that they otherwise wouldn't. We've had a lot of Iranians here, for example, because Armenia is on the border of Iran. And if you know anything about Iran, it's like the dark ages there,
Mm.
politically and socially. Like you can get stoned to death for a
Yeah.
variety of innocuous lifestyle choices. And
Yeah.
so a lot of Iranians, like the open minded, free thinking ones, are eager to get out of Iran. But they
Mm.
have a very poor quality passport. It's very difficult for them to travel internationally or to get work in other countries. There are sanctions against Iranians. And so a lot of the people that have come here from there have been very, very grateful for the opportunity that I've provided for them by giving them a place to live, a place to express themselves as the type of people they want to be, and to learn things that otherwise they would not have had the opportunity to do. And it's also very good for the Armenians to get exposed to different kinds of people coming from different cultural backgrounds who speak different languages, because otherwise there's this very isolationist effect here where there's a lot of national and ethnic pride, which in a certain context sounds like a good thing. Like, yeah, you should be proud of your country, proud of your race, I guess, the proud traditional Armenian people, but it also biases you against other people and closes you off to external forms of influence.
Mm.
So where's the balance between those two things? If you're never exposed to people who look a different way, who think a different way, who act a different way, you develop this kind of bias and prejudice that the way you do things is by default the best way to do things, and there's something wrong with other people for not doing them the way you do them.
Right.
And so that's what we're slowly fighting against, kind of through just exposure therapy, I guess.
Mm.
Not sitting there and lecturing and saying, here's how things work, here's how you should do things, here's the germ theory of disease, here's how the wheel works,
Yeah.
which again has been very humbling for me because that's my modus operandi. I'm a teacher.
Mm.
That's what I do. I explain how things work. But that's not what these people need, and it's not what's going to be effective on them. What they just
Yeah.
need is exposure until eventually they overcome their biases and they see, oh, this thing that I thought was harmful isn't harming me, actually.
Yeah.
It's in fact in many ways it's benefiting me. That spider in the corner of my ceiling has been there for years and has never once tried to kill me.
Right.
Maybe spiders are okay. Actually, I
Yeah.
noticed that it catches a lot of flies and mosquitoes that otherwise would have been bothering me.
Right.
Maybe spiders are actually good in some ways. Huh, I never thought of it that way before.
Yeah.
And even if it takes me years to eventually figure that out just through
Yeah.
exposure,
Right.
that's progress.
Cool. Very cool. So how did you? I'm kind of curious about the internet. I know it seems trivial to what you're doing and everything, but how does the internet work there? Is it uh, it's kind of the same as here in the States where it's like there's the monopolies of different companies that provide the internet and you kind of go from there, or is it done by the government or what is it?
No, it's a private industry. There are a few
Private
major
industry.
providers throughout the country, and one of the first things I checked when I first came to this village was, do I get good internet here? And surprisingly, I do, despite the fact that we're fairly remote, because
Wow.
obviously we're having this conversation right now, and I do a
Yeah, and
lot of
it's
work
been pretty
through video
stable.
calls. Yeah, and so that would have been a major detriment that I would not have been able to do many of the things I've done. My ability to make money, my ability to produce books, work with clients, or my ability to look up information I needed,
Mm,
right? As I'm learning all these new things and adapting to situations on the fly, or even just using like Google Translate, because I don't still speak great Armenian. So I
mm,
frequently need to look up new words to communicate with people. And the internet has really done a lot to disable barriers to interaction, communication, and expansion, right? And
cool,
that will only continue to be true.
cool. Do you have mostly of your computer interface mostly English, or is it Armenian, or a mix of
No,
both,
I,
or?
I work entirely in English. And as a testament to what I was saying before about how useful English is as a global language, I can come to Armenia and still interact 90% of the time in English and live a thriving life here. The
Wow.
average Armenian could not move to any other country in the world only speaking Armenian and expect to do nearly the same thing,
Ah,
right? Because English
yeah,
is just so much more prominent of a language, right?
right. Yeah.
And I'm not at all saying like don't learn Armenian. Like you can still speak Armenian, but also you can learn English and
Yeah.
interact with the world on a whole other level of operation.
Cool. So, what do you actually you kind of hinted at it of like you're teaching entrepreneurship, self-actualization. What are some of the things that you seem to be someone who combines the more meaningful stuff with the more practical stuff at the same time, which most people do divorce it, and it drives me crazy. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but what are some of the examples of some of the stuff that you is it basically depend on who comes to you and what they need to learn? Or is it you have a curriculum, or how does that work?
Well, we're still figuring that out.
Oh, okay.
Um, our volunteer program was partially born out of necessity because we just needed more work done on the house and there simply weren't enough people available to do the work. And
Mm,
sometimes it's simple domestic things, like some people just want to work in the kitchen all day and cook and clean and organize things, and that's great. It's really valuable. And a lot of people want to do backbreaking work in construction, right? And we need that because
mm,
there's just no way to continue expanding and developing without people to actually help do the work, right?
mm.
And so we've been doing that for about a year. We've had over 100 volunteers here in that time from a few dozen countries at this point.
Oh,
But also, it wasn't just about work, it was about the cultural experience, bringing together all these
wow.
people from all these places with different backgrounds, different skills, different perspectives. But there has to be some shared goal among all of us.
Mm.
And we've certainly made a lot of mistakes too. I recently posted an article on the Calavan Retreat Center blog called Six Types of Volunteers We Don't Want at the Calavan Retreat Center, because we have learned through experience from some very good people and some very bad people who have come
Oh,
here. And I don't want to say like, oh, they're bad people, but like
yeah.
just clearly the wrong type of people. Some of them were bad people. I say we have a policy now, and I always inform new potential volunteers who want to come here. We don't allow assholes, losers, or freeloaders here.
Mm,
And what I mean by that is assholes are people who simply do not respect other people.
right.
Like, there's just no other way to put it than that. Like they're not considerate of the space they're sharing with other people. They very often like aggressive and commanding, and they think it's their job to like to tell other people what to do all the time or to insist things are done a certain way because it's the way they like to do them. So obviously those people should not be traveling to a remote location in a house full of strangers if that's how they want to live. They
Yeah,
should have their own house where they can make all the rules and then they'd be fine, right?
yeah.
Losers, which might seem a bit too Tori, but it's essentially someone in a desperate situation who wants us to like solve other problems for them. They're
Mm.
not coming here to experience being part of a community where we can all learn and benefit. They're like, I'm poor, I can't feed my kids, I don't know what I'm doing with my life. Please solve all my problems for me. Like
Uh,
that's essentially what kind of person.
yeah.
And part of me wants to like empathize and say like, well, yeah, I'd like to help you out, but I realized very quickly if I get into that kind of situation with someone who's desperate and willing to agree to anything and do anything, they're not really using rational judgment,
No,
because that's what desperation does to you, right? You're not
yes.
really thinking, is this actually a good fit for me and for the people I'm going to be cohabitating with? It's just, oh my god, I don't know what to do, please help me, right? I'll do
Yeah.
anything. That's survival mentality. That's
Yeah.
not what our volunteer program is for. Those people need some kind of charity or emergency
Or
government
ministry.
help or
Yeah.
something. I don't know. Yeah, go to a
Yeah.
church or something. But that's
Yeah.
not what we're doing here. And I had to very quickly set that boundary that that is not
Mm.
what we are doing, right? So I'm sorry, but we are not the right people to help you.
Right.
And a freeloader is simply somebody who comes here because they want a free place to live,
Yeah.
right? And sometimes they still do the work required of them, but often they don't. Like they will come up with every excuse possible to avoid the agreements we've made, that if you come here, we expect you to help work at least a few hours a day, and we're quite flexible in how you do that, the type of work you want to do, but you have to be contributing value of some kind while you're
Yeah.
here. And if you don't,
You have to be a team player.
yeah, what are you doing here? Like, there are
Yeah.
other people who want to come here and you're taking their spot. So
Yeah.
gonna
Yeah.
if that goes on for more than a week, I'm just gonna say, get out of my house. Like, what are you
Yeah.
doing here?
Yeah.
I shouldn't have to explain this to you.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's cool.
So I've had to adapt into the role of a social leader and manager once I
Mm.
started taking those volunteers in, because largely before that I was fairly isolated, which actually I really enjoyed to a large extent. It got lonely at times, but
Mm.
it gives you this lifestyle freedom that you don't have when you're living in a city or with other people, but where
Mm.
you really are just, it feels almost like you're on the edge of the earth and
Mm.
your time is your own to figure out what you want to do with it. So if you want to sit and read all day, you can do that and no one can tell you not to. It's like
Right.
being retired, right? But
Right.
now that I constantly have new people coming in, I have to manage things and make sure there's social harmony in our house. And
Yeah.
yeah, I've had to adapt and become a new type of person, which is good, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm always seeking to adapt and expand and learn new things
Yeah.
and grow as a person.
Cool. So, am I understanding that there's an academy attached to your house or being built or something?
There's an extension behind the house, but
Okay.
it's not a formal academy. But we offer educational opportunities just with the people who come here and among the locals who want to visit us, because many of the
Okay.
people who've
So
come
the
here have
for the
been,
volunteers and for the
yeah.
locals. Okay,
And
I get
we
you.
would
It's
like
not an
that.
academy. I apologize. I
Well,
apologize for that.
we would like that to be one of the ultimate goals, is to offer formalized training in education and things that simply don't exist in this country. And we have to do
Ah.
that. We have to build a reputation. We have to finish the construction on the house, and we have to offer some kind of structured schedule to these things,
Mm.
right? But as it is now, like, on our balcony, we have a sign written in both English and Armenian that says like free English lessons. Why? Because it's one way we can start to break through that barrier, that the locals around us will see that. And if they actually want their kids or themselves, the adults, to learn English, now they have at least one viable way to do that from a native English speaker and experienced teacher, instead of going to the shitty school that doesn't actually teach them English, even though it pretends to, right?
Mm.
So we have to at least start to make these opportunities available and visible in a way that people who see the problem can do something about them.
Mm. Does out of curiosity, in Armenia, are they it, your village seems to be well connected internet wise. Are the other Armenians on the internet?
To a degree. In the cities, like the capital city Yerevan, things are quite modern. It's quite different than out here in a rural setting.
Ah.
Uh, it's like existing in multiple time periods simultaneously. In many
Huh.
ways, it feels like 1950s America, and in other ways, it feels very modern. So
Huh.
there's this mixing of idiosyncratic influences and anachronistic ways of doing things that often feel out of place. And I think that eventually, with enough people embracing modern new ways of doing things, they start to influence the people who have been resistant and kind of holding out
Mm.
and trying not to change.
Mm.
Eventually, if everyone is using the internet around you and speaking English around you and accomplishing things in more efficient ways, uh, that's how you eventually influence everyone. Again, not through like
Mm.
lecturing at them or forcing them to change,
Yeah.
but eventually they just see, okay, everyone around me is doing this in a different way now. It seems to be working out for them. I guess fine, I'll do it that way too.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of they in. Do they have smartphones? Or do they not have
Yeah,
smartphones? They do.
actually, that's something I've seen all over the world, and even the most impoverished places I've been, smartphones are just everywhere. It's kind of
Wow.
amazing. Yeah,
Yeah,
like
that
people who
is.
don't have indoor plumbing have
Wow.
smartphones. Doesn't make any
That's
sense to
cool.
me, but here we are.
For good and for
Yeah,
ill, it's like there's a whole dynamic
yeah,
of
for better or worse,
yeah.
right?
Wow.
Yeah.
Um, what are some things that you would like to talk about that I'm forgetting to ask you about that you'd like to share?
Well, it seems like your primary focus is on improving education and particularly self-education, right?
Mm, yeah, I, I'm kind of for me. I just want to hear other people's stories
Mm-hmm.
of what, particularly self-learners or lifelong learners. It can include academic researchers and stuff. That's fine. I don't mind. But the focus is more on adult learning than children learning. If children are actually pursuing, um, like you did as a child, you had other things you like to learn about instead of what was just being taught in the curriculum at
Mm.
school. I'm open to talking to them if their parents are comfortable with that. Um, I, I just want to hear the other stories that of other learners out there. I don't have an agenda per se. I am working on uh, this when this is going to be published. I'm going to be having a learners club, which I'll have another video about that, and the information can be found on my website. Let me put the banner up real quick. So NARFellowship.com. If you go to NARFellowship.com, you can learn about the Learners Club in Loveland, Colorado. If you happen to be in the northern Colorado area, check out the website for the details or check out the other video on the details for the Learners Club. But I just want to learn with other learners, kind of like a book club, but everybody studies their own stuff, kind of thing. And I kind of came up with it last year, and I've been pondering it and figuring it out. And I want to. One of the tests that I did was the Strength Finder test, and one of the things I was really high in was being connection was really a big part of who I am as a person integrally. Is I
Mm-hmm.
like making connections and talking with people and building relationships and stuff. And so for me, the learning is one of my passions, and just talking and befriending other people is two things I enjoy. Um, I I want to help understand I I want to help other people by understanding where other people are coming from in the learning space. That there's a lot of like college stuff, there's a lot of homeschooling stuff, there's a lot of um, you know continuing education stuff. It's all academic and stuff in nature, but there's not a lot on YouTube or other channels that I can find. Maybe I'm just using the wrong keywords. Other self learners who are just learning stuff. And I'm just curious about what they're learning and why and what's helped them and what things they did overcome, what tools they found helpful. I just want to understand the arena as well as the people. And that's why I did this. I'm doing this podcast. It's more of a personal endeavor and, just understanding a group of people that everybody seems to be ignoring. And so it's like I find them fascinating. So, does that help answer your question?
Yeah. It sounds like you're trying to encourage people to adopt this autodidactic, self-learning, self-directed kind of lifestyle,
Mm-hmm.
and they need more community support to do that.
Yeah, I,
Yeah.
I, yeah, that sounds about right. I was hoping to reach people who already are doing it, but it would be nice for other people to be learners as well. I think it would be a good thing for them to grow and expand and enrich their lives and pursue. In one of my fan fiction stories, I have a samurai country that I've kind of elaborated on, and I made them kind of the wisdom capital of the world. They're the only ones that have a public library out of all the ninja nations. They're the
Okay.
only samurai country. And you're probably familiar with Naruto, the anime.
Vaguely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's kind of based on that. It's just something I play with. It's not, a super great story or anything, but I came up with the path of wisdom. And
Okay.
for them, they it kind of personify my love of learning. And their whole culture is based on um, balancing the mind and the body, the, being an embodied person, but also growing with their mind. And they can pursue any learning endeavor they wish, as many as they wish. Um, and it was one of the things that classism would kind of fall apart for, to enable different people, like a young lord could learn from a carpenter about wood, carpentry and wood uh,
Hmm.
sculpting and all this kind of stuff. And that was my, it's my fan fiction. I can do what I want with it. Um, but so in my mind, I have this thing of like, pursue your path of wisdom. Hopefully, it includes some wisdom of some tradition, whether it's philosophy or religion, or different religion perspectives, understanding, you know, Hindus and Buddhism and whatever else, maybe even Muslim. They have a huge, rich tradition of learning and education in their history. It's gorgeous. I need to like learn more about it. Um, but there's like there's a lot of knowledge and wisdom available, and we're in the most connected age right now where we can learn stuff. It's a matter of cultivating our wisdom and cultivating our knowledge. And it's something I'm passionate about, and I want to help other people, you know, be more enriched. I have a very humble, you know, my whole family has disabilities and health conditions, and my brother and I are caregivers to my mom and my sister-in-law. And so, one of the things that gives me hope and perseverance is actually learning, not only for practical things, but also uh, just for self edification. And it empowers me to feel like I can do something with my life. And I want to give that to other people.
So I think what you're touching on, and one thing we haven't really talked about yet, is the value of personal mentorship, which goes beyond
Yes,
just education, because you
yes.
can get educated from any source of information, a good book, right? A good
Mm,
video, a good lecture.
yeah.
Um, but mentorship goes beyond that because it has this personal emotional effect upon you to feel
Mm,
like there's someone who understands you and is capable of leading you and guiding you in the way you particularly need to be led and
mm,
guided.
yeah.
And that is a much higher standard to reach and much rarer because it's really not scalable in the way like a book is. Because I
Mm,
can write a book that explains how to teach English really well, and potentially many thousands of people can read it, right?
yeah.
But for me to be a personal mentor to thousands of people would be a much more difficult task because it requires
Yeah.
this level of personal interaction that
Yeah.
often we're simply not fortunate enough to have. I've had a few good personal mentors in my life, but they're few and far between, right?
Mm,
And even just like the people I only knew for a couple of years, like before they died or something, I
mm,
remember so vividly the effect they had on me because they had that rare, much needed personal mentoring kind of influence on me, right?
mm,
Um, I think that's why we write fiction often in the way we do, that we create kind of archetypes of mentors that guide
yeah.
us from the
Yeah.
stories that we love, the Obi-Wan Kenobis and Gandalfs of our lives, who even though again they're not real people, but that kind of influence they have in the world of the story affects us here in the real world because we needed somebody to guide us in that way and to teach us the things that our parents and our teachers and other authority figures just usually aren't able to do.
Yeah. That's really well said. I do ask people, like I had one gentleman who was a carpenter and an author on, and he's from my little corner of the internet, kind of spurred on by Jordan Peterson, but not not directly related to him, but it's like a lot of the pathway was people finding each other kind of thing. And he is involved in trying to help create a tenaconic school to mentor young men in life as well as carpentry or whatever else might be of help for them. Because he saw really lack of mentoring and he wanted to be part of the solution.
Mm-hmm.
And mentoring is very organic from what I'm getting from different people I've talked to. Is uh, not only skill based but also emotional based, like you were saying. And what are your have you ever mentored anybody?
Well, the specifics and the scalability kind of apply in both directions in the
Hmm.
sense that just as it's really hard to find a very good mentor that's exactly what you particularly need,
Mm.
as a mentor, it's often very hard to find a very good student or mentee who is in a position to learn exactly the way that you teach or the way that you influence, because again, it goes
Mm.
beyond just raw education. And I've had several of those in my life, um, many of whom I would say graduated in the sense that they no longer needed me as a mentor. And that's the best possible outcome, right? To
Yeah.
obsolete yourself, to give them the influence they need so that they no longer need it because
Yeah.
they've applied it in their life and become their own person, right?
Yeah.
Um, in the same way that I was once a mentee and now I consider myself a mentor because I grew as a result of that influence and started passing it on to other people. And also sometimes the opposite happens, which is a very, very heartbreaking experience if you've ever been through it, which is somebody that you are very invested in who in seeing them grow and learn and evolve emotionally and intellectually fails at that task.
Mm.
If to borrow Star Wars terminology, when they turn to the dark side.
Ah. Yeah.
If you know the story of Star Wars and the central plot point of what happens to the main
Yeah.
characters in Star Wars,
Yeah.
no spoilers.
Yeah.
um, but it's essentially when somebody with a lot of potential fails to embody that potential for various emotional reasons and kind of sacrifices everything they're
Mm.
capable of and becomes a much worse version of themselves when they surrender to their insecurities, their fears, their negative emotions, and can no longer embody all the higher states that they are
Mm.
capable of. That's
Yeah.
something I think that you have to go through as a mentor because you're not always going to be successful. And you can
Yeah.
sit there and beat yourself up wondering, what did I do wrong that allowed this to happen? Am I responsible for this? Or is
Yeah.
this something they were going to do anyway? And it's their responsibility and they made the wrong choice and I have to
Right.
live with that.
Yeah. That's hard. Yeah. That's something that nobody talks about is the when they go wrong.
Yeah. And that's just part of the role that you take
Yeah.
on, that you have to
It's part of the
deal with
risk.
that and keep going.
Yeah. What were some of the things that the good mentors did for you? The ones that you really connected with. What were some of the things that you can think of that how they resonated with you and helped you grow?
I think more than anything, what I needed as a young man, and that for some reason nobody could give me for a very long time, was simply somebody older than me, more experienced than me, whose opinion I trusted to say, hey, kid, you're really bright, you're really capable, um, but you got a lot to learn. There's a lot of
Mm.
experience you need to have to mature and to grow into the person you're capable of being. But you have to trust your own judgment and realize that, yeah, a lot of the things you think are wrong about the world are wrong, right? And it's
Mm.
good that you figured that out. But here's what you should do with that impulse and that information, right? Don't just sit and be bitter and rebellious like it's time to grow up now. And here's how you can do that. And if that's
Mm.
coming, particularly from men, coming from like masculine figures in our lives, we need an example of what we can and should become. right?
Mm.
Men really, really need that from other men. And that's really hard to do, especially when you feel like you're smarter than everyone else around you, because I respect intellect, among other things, like
Mm.
character and virtue, right? But like
Yeah.
I could only learn from somebody that I considered of comparable or greater intelligence to myself, because that's just the kind of person I am. That may sound very elitist, but that's what, particularly as a young man, I respected those few times that I met somebody that, wow, I could really learn a lot from this person, or the way they think about the world is amazing. Like that's when I will take in
Mm.
everything they have to say and learn as much as possible from their influence. And virtually everyone else I would have disregarded,
Mm.
right?
Interesting. That's really helpful and very, very insightful.
And
So,
that's the kind of influence I've tried to have too on some other people who've come into my life who are usually, a bit younger, very capable people. And I remember one one young woman, very smart young woman. She was in her early 20s, and when she met me, she seemed like really eager to learn a lot from me, hear what I have to say, read my books. And I said to her, I mean, I don't know you very well yet, but I'm getting the sense that you're probably used to being the smartest person in any room you walk into, right? Like you just walk in and know that you're generally brighter than almost everyone else around you, and you probably are. But that makes you a little bit cocky, right?
yeah,
Right? Because I know from experience what that's like, right? But now that you're in a room with me, you're wondering, is this person smarter than me? And you're thinking, what can I learn from this person? And it's like exciting for you, right? Because you're so used to the opposite being true that virtually no one can teach you anything worth listening to, right?
yeah.
And now suddenly you're in a room with someone that you think you can learn a lot from, right? Am I right? And she's like, yeah, basically, because
Wow.
that's what it was for me too, particularly as a teenager and in my early 20s. Like it's so hard to get that kind of influence you need, and when you finally latch onto it, it's really exciting, right? Like,
Yeah,
oh my god, someone who knows more than me.
yeah. That's cool. Uh, we take what we experience and be able to resonate with other people who's similar than us, to us, I should say. Well, I've been, we're almost at 2 hours. I don't want to keep you too long. You've been very gracious with your time. Um, I'll have one last question I usually like to keep for the end.
Okay.
Before I ask you that, is there anything you wanted to ask me um, I- that you were curious about, or had something spark a thought in your mind, or whatever?
I guess, how successful do you feel in your quest?
I'm trying to be humble about it. And yes, I'd love to be big like Joe Rogan and stuff, but I'm not as polished as his team is. It's just
Okay.
little old me doing my thing. Um, I think for me, what I measure success as is slowly growing and getting to know people and just really learning to listen well to other people like yourselves and other guests and just hearing their story and just try to track with them as a good listener. There's not a lot of books out there of how to be a good interviewer unless you're talking about job interviews. Um, and if somebody has a book recommendation for me, go ahead and put it in the comments below. Um, but, you know, people like Charlie Rose and um, what's the other gentleman's name? I'm forgetting. But Charlie Rose comes to mind as a really good interviewer. And I'm like, what did he learn? How did he learn to be a good interviewer and and be, interested in? I can't always read all the books that people, I have a list of about 11 to 12 that in Goodreads that I'm reading. I'm going back and forth to different books, and but I want to be able to be a good listener, and I think to be successful, I just need to put in the hours and put in the time, not get into you know, uh, um, a flurry of activity just to drum up, clicks and views, but more to really connect with you, my viewers, and just learn as I grow. that would be successful and see
So
where
that's
the
how you
open
define
door goes.
success. Yeah.
So yeah, I would be like to be rich and famous and you know not have stalkers. That would be good. I don't have any now. I hope I never do. But weird stuff happens, especially in this line of work.
Well, like in the influential author, I say, because the book is about, giving people the confidence and the guidance to write probably their first book, right?
Mm,
And so I stress you have to define what success in this endeavor means for you. Is it possible you will sell many thousands of copies and make a good income from this? Yeah, I certainly have with some of my books. But it also is it possible that even if you write an amazing book, that not many people will ever hear about it or buy it, right? Yeah, that's also possible.
yeah,
But what if you don't sell that many copies overall, but some of the people who do buy and read your book email you years later and say, "Oh my God, your book changed my life. It completely changed the way I think about this really important subject." And is that success for you? Like, is that
yeah,
worth it? That you spent a year of your life writing this book that only 100 people read and you never
yeah,
made any money from, but it really, really made a big difference for those people. Like, is
yeah,
that make it worth it for you?
yeah. That would that would be heartening. I remember my dad he was an actor, writer, director, and he passed away in 2011 from a heart attack. But um, we were never rich and famous. We were mostly in the trenches working in Colorado in media production and stuff. And the outpouring of love from people after he passed away was many, many different stories of how he changed their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And he never won an Oscar, never won an Academy Award or anything like that, or not even been able to produce his own movies. But his life was meaningful. He loved people. He was very generous and kind, and it wasn't in vain. And
And again, going back to the history of like scientific discovery, most of history's great geniuses and inventors and discoverers were not appreciated in their own lifetime.
yeah,
Think about that. How
yeah,
disappointing that might have been, how discouraging that might have been.
yeah,
But maybe generations later, people figured out, this Isaac Newton guy, he was onto something. We should look more into
yeah,
this, right? And then
yeah,
eventually it completely changes the way we do physics, right?
yeah, yeah. That's true. That's really true. I really appreciate being able to talk with you, and if you ever want to come back on, I'd love to have you on as a guest again,
Okay.
and we talk more about the other books as well, because there's lots of interesting stuff in there. We're just, you know, a, kind of tasting, a little bit, of what you can offer and your wide range of experience and knowledge and everything. Um, my last question for you is: do you have any last thoughts or words of encouragement for other learners?
Trust your own judgment.
Mm,
If you're smart and you know you're smart, that's not a bad thing. Don't let the world make you feel bad about that, because often it does for some reason. Like, knowing that you're smart is discouraged. Like, taking pride in that. Being arrogant about it is certainly bad, but there's a healthy level of trusting your own assessment, realizing when things make sense and when they don't, being self-determined enough to act on that. That's kind of that wisdom, that mentorship that I most prominently needed when I was younger. So I'm giving that to you now. I give you permission to trust your own judgment and make decisions that make sense to you, even if the entire world disagrees with you.
yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you very, very much. Well, thank you for watching our fellowship. We'll see you next time. Bye.